In the chapel of St. Olaf's College in Northfield, Minnesota, there are a variety of beautiful stained glass windows, but the most beautiful of all is one that is known as the Transfiguration window. It is very high in a wall above the organ case, and it features, as you might expect from the story we've just heard, the portrayal of Jesus dressed in glowing, shimmering white robes, his face transformed and illuminated, standing with Moses and Elijah and the disciples. And the rest of this particular stained glass window also has visions from the Revelation to John, that remarkable, confusing last book in the Bible. And it has the river of the water of life flowing through, and some of the other scenes that John depicts in the Revelation, including Jesus holding the 7 churches in his hand, the 7 churches to which part of the book of Revelation is addressed. It's a remarkable and beautiful and beloved window, and as I said, Jesus is glowing and magnificent, and when the sun comes through, he is simply glorious and gorgeous. All except his feet. His feet, which are bony and pointy and narrow and calloused. Just like the feet of the disciples, just like the feet of everybody else in the picture, there is nothing about his feet that is transfigured or transformed. It's a very striking juxtaposition to the rest of the glorious presentation of the transfigured Christ. And some people, I think, perhaps probably find it a little sacrilegious to portray the transfigured, transformed Jesus having these feet that are bony and pointy and calloused. But I don't. Because I think the very power of this event that we commemorate today, every year on the last Sunday of Epiphany, as the threshold into Lent, we hear about the transfiguration in one version or another. I think the very power of it is not the miraculous so much as the fact that the glory of the divinity in Jesus shines through what is still a fully human Jesus of Nazareth. It's a remarkable moment, and some scholars, of course, put it right up along with the incarnation, the resurrection, and other of the most important events in Jesus' life and ministry, and with good reason. Now, over the centuries, a lot has been made by scholars and preachers and priests, I mean, I've preached on it many times, that this moment was such an opportune experience, both for Jesus and the disciples coming when it did. If you remember, if you heard how the gospel began, we heard that 6 days after Peter had confirmed or confessed Jesus as the Christ, he went up on the mountain with James and John and with Jesus. The disciples, after Peter has acknowledged Christ as the Messiah, hear Jesus for the first time predict what is going to happen in Jerusalem, that there he is going to be betrayed in the hands of the authorities, he's going to be put to death. And that's too much, of course, too much for the disciples, especially for poor Peter, who impulsively says, "God forbid, Lord, that will never happen to you," which prompts, you'll remember, Jesus to say, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not on the side of God, but of mortals." And this moment that we heard about today takes place, it's the next event we hear about following that confession of Peter. And many people have said over the years that surely the disciples, Peter and James and John, representing all the 12 and others beyond them, surely they needed this moment. They needed this experience of transformation, of transfiguration, of illumination, of glory, in order to sustain them for the events that were going to happen in Jerusalem very soon. They needed this vision of heavenly glory breaking through the mundanity of our lives in order to sustain them as they experienced the rejection, the crucifixion, the fear, the anxiety. Yes, they needed it. And some people believe that Jesus himself probably needed this moment, that he needed this moment knowing, having a premonition of what was going to take place. He himself needed this vision of the glory that would resolve the resurrection, beyond the resurrection. He needed that to be able to look Pilate and Herod in the eye, in order to be able to sustain himself through the temptation in the Garden of Gethsemane, when we are told he wept tears of blood. That he needed this moment to bring him through the ridicule of the soldiers, the cowardice of his friends. All of that is true and part of the story. But it's not what speaks to me today. What speaks to me today are those bony, pointed, calloused feet. Because if the transfiguration is to have any power at all, it is because it is Jesus the man, the carpenter, the rabbi, the teacher, the preacher, who is transformed and transfigured, but does not take refuge only in the holiness, remains fully who he is as the man, even as he is transformed. So the transfiguration, in a sense, reminds us that the line, the border, the boundary between the holy and the mundane, between the sacred and the everyday, might be a lot thinner than we often think it is. That in those, quote, mountaintop experiences, we are getting that foretaste, that hint, that glimmer of what not only awaits us, but is available now in our current lives and world, if we are just open to it. Of course, there's some wonderful things in this story that I just love. I love Peter. I mean, how can you not love Peter? I mean, the constant bumbler, rash and impulsive and almost always doing the wrong thing. I mean, he stands in for us. I can identify with Peter. And what happens today, of course, Peter, when he sees Moses and Elijah with his Lord, I mean, what does he do? Lord, it's good we're here. Good thing you brought us. We can make 3 booths for you. Let's preserve the moment. Let's hang on to this photo op. And as he's still speaking, we are told the cloud comes over and God begins to say, "This is my son." It's, I think, the only time in all of Scripture that God has to work hard to get a word in edgewise. So I love Peter. He stands. I would have reacted exactly the same way he did. So would you, I bet. Again, the humanity, the naturalness, the reality of this event, the power of it lies not so much in the fact that Jesus was transformed, but that it gave us the window, the glimpse, and also reveals that Jesus was still Jesus. Mindful of and perhaps reminded, even perhaps intensified in his understanding of his identity and his mission, sustained for what was to come, but nevertheless the same man with those bony, pointed, calloused feet who had walked hundreds of miles through Palestine and through Galilee with the disciples, and who was fully part of our life, our world. Of course, the truth is that Jesus doesn't stay on the mountain, does he? He comes down. He goes up for the transfiguring moment in order to come back down. To come back down into the petty squabbles and the rivalries of his disciples and those who followed him and the religious and political authorities. To come back down into the poverty and pain that are part and parcel of our world. To come back down into the brokenness and the fear and the anxiety that so pervade our being. To come down in the very next episode to heal a boy with epilepsy. He didn't stay there. His humanity was infused with the divinity so that he could come down and get back to work, so to speak. He didn't take refuge in the top of the mountain. He didn't stay up there. He didn't try to maintain the moment beyond its natural course, but came down, fully God, fully human, in order once again to inhabit and to love and live into our world. And that moment, this moment of transfiguration, of transformation, is perhaps above all a reminder to us that such moments can come when we least expect them. They can come in the most unanticipated and unremarkable ways and forms. A word, a sip of wine and a piece of bread, a breeze, a stranger, a vision, a moment wherein we feel God's grace and transforming love and power entering us and our lives. Thomas Merton, the great monk, theologian, scholar, and mystic, in one of his books, talks about being at the corner of 4th and Walnut in Louisville, one in the middle of the shopping market when he was a young man, and suddenly having this realization that everybody around him was somebody he loved. He didn't know any of them. They were all complete strangers, but he loved them by virtue of the fact that they all shared a common humanity. And he said, what a glorious realization that I was part of a world in which God became incarnate. At 4th and Walnut in Louisville. Those moments of transformation, of grace, can happen anywhere, anytime, if we are but open to the whisper of the Spirit. Opening our eyes, our hearts, our souls, our spirits to the way in which God can transform us. Bony, pointed, calloused feet that we may have. And that's the power of the transfiguration. He doesn't stay on the top of the mountain. He doesn't stay in that transfigured state. He comes down into our lives and into our world so that we too might be filled with grace and transformation. And how? And when? This afternoon or this coming week or in the next 3 months, how and when will we be transformed? How will God's Spirit waft into our lives in unexpected, unanticipated ways with our bony, calloused feet? How will we be transformed?